effort, quite a long way. We have some of our friends from near the Limpopo. Thank you very much for coming. It's good to see the Zimbos here and return a bit of the hospitality they sort of gave us. I hear they gave Jack and Mandy a better time than me, so no, thank you very much. And then also to PJ, I'm sure you all remember PJ, the world cattleman. I don't think he stays a single day at home. He's always in the air flying around looking at cattle all over the world. And PJ, thank you very much for coming to little old Kenya and seeing our cattle and coming to talk today. Thank you. And then also thank you to my wife Nikki and to Janine for organizing all the food, and to the Warrigus team and my boys for sorting out the whole area. Thank you very much. Over to PJ.
I really appreciate this invitation. This is my 4th trip to Kenya, and every time I land here, it's like a jet lag cure. It really is. You arrive here and the world starts making sense, and I look forward to being back again in the future. A little bit of a disclaimer. I woke up this morning feeling like the emperor that had no clothes on, because all my clothes are left in Bulgaria and in Austria. They lost my bags. So wearing sneakers to address cattlemen, in most cases, you'd feel awful. And then I woke up this morning and all the Kenyan farmers had tennis shoes on. So I'll pretend like I planned it. When in Rome, put your tennis shoes on. And the other thing is, the other disclaimer I have to bring forth is a lot of my philosophies and my ways of looking at livestock. This is going to be a session of, it's more like an audition or preaching to the choir maybe, because you guys have been practicing this for a lot longer than I've even been around. When I give these talks in Europe or especially in Asia and North America, there are a lot of new ideas, but for you it's all old stuff. So let's treat this as an audition, and at the end we can see if I've learned anything from you or not. So the basic premise for today is going to be just a global perspective on livestock production and the challenges and opportunities that we're facing. It's a little bit of a thought experiment. A lot of these ideas aren't proven science. It's just ideas, and I know there might be better ideas or ways to refine these ideas in the crowd. I mean, I've seen enough of your cattle and the way you guys do it to know that you've got a few tricks up your sleeve. So if we can make this a kind of a teamwork, that would be great. For those of you that I haven't met before, I'm PJ Butler. I was born and raised on a 5th generation cattle operation in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, about 3.5 hours inland from Port Elizabeth and East London. And we ran registered cattle, sheep and goats, and my mom had horses just to help us eat away as much profit as we were making. And the cattle side of it is what really captured my attention and my heart from a young age. So at 15, I started my own registered herds, and when I left high school, I went and worked in Scotland for a year on an Angus and Hereford farm, and came back to university. And after university, my herds had grown substantially by then, and I got involved with a property developer who builds shopping malls and golf courses and hotels all over the world. And he had cattle, so we blended our herds together. And by 2012, when I left South Africa, we were running about 1,500 registered cows, and that was on 5 properties. So it was in the Eastern Cape, which was high altitude, cold winters, dry, hot summers. And we had Hereford and Angus and Red Angus down there. And then north of Pretoria and Cullinan, we had Brahman and Braford and some Brahman Hereford F1 cows. And that's an interesting part of the world. It's getting subtropical. It's got a whole cocktail of tick diseases. You've got heart water, red water, gall sickness, and then we had challenges with theft, and we had challenges with hyenas and stuff that we weren't used to having in the Eastern Cape. We started 2 herds in Namibia, in Otjiwarongo and in Gobabis, which was totally different climate, beautiful for raising cattle, dry and healthy. And we had Beefmasters and Braford and Brahman up there. And then on the island of Mauritius, where we started a herd of 300 beef cows, and they get about 3 meters of rain a year, very tropical, leached out soils, weak grasses, and challenges with human capital in terms of developing programs there. So anyway, why I'm giving you that background is what it taught me was that the first thing was that if animals aren't adapted, you can't do anything with them. So, and the second thing was there's no breed that works everywhere. You've got to fit certain breeds or composites to your environments. And that gave me an appetite for working cattle internationally. So in 2012, I sold my shares in what was Bonhaven Beef Cattle then, and moved to the US to establish this global livestock initiative. And the reason I chose Texas was logistically, it's so easy to get around the world from there. There's a lot of cattle business going on in Texas, and we're close to an airport that literally goes anywhere in the world in a single flight. So that's me at age, I don't know, 2, 3, watching the cattle come through the dip, and then this was judging the interbreed at the Canadian Western Agribition a couple of years ago. And what I'm going to try and fill you in is just stuff I've seen around the world between those two periods, and observations that I've made. Right now, I work for work with 4 different companies. This is just to contextualize some of my philosophies. The top left, Transover Genetics, is a biotechnology company. We make about 450,000 embryos a year. We clone make 500 clone cattle a year, a few thousand clone pigs, and we do gene editing and AI and all that. And I'm the international business manager, so setting up labs in different countries, joint ventures, etc. So that's been quite an eye-opener, especially on the dairy side, which I wasn't very familiar with before. Top right, it's a company called Tangible Trading Company. So I'm the director of livestock, and what the main objective there is exporting livestock, beef, and animal feeds. It's based in Dallas. We got a 50,000 head feedlot in West Texas, and then a few cow-calf operations attached to it. And that's also been very interesting because just meeting the needs and demands of an international market, but understanding the value of adapted cattle even in a feedlot situation. Bottom left is the company I started, Global Livestock Solutions. So any consulting or judging shows or speaking at events, sourcing purebred semen for companies or purebred cattle for export, I do through that. And then Wagyu 365, myself and 2 guys started this company. We have 2 auctions a month, so it's Wagyu cattle, semen, and embryos. And those 4 businesses have kept me moving and sleeping in airports and buses and trains and hotels for the last 10 years. And it's been an amazing trip. I'm exhausted and jet lagged my whole life, but what I've learned and seen, I think it's taken me to 101 countries now, and I think I've worked with 76 different breeds in all these countries. So what it's done is it's opened my mind, but it's also made me a bit of a jack of all trades and master of none. So I'm about 30 miles wide and only an inch deep. So if you get too technical with your questions, I'm going to pass the ball to a specialist that's in the crowd. These are just pictures working in different areas. That's Norway and Romania, a big Angus program we're doing down there. This is Uruguay down in South America. And at top left is Honduras, a little Brahman bull there, and Finland, the Colombian Charolais, and up at the Canadian Western Agribition doing Charolais cattle up there. So the first ever job I got as an international cattle consultant was in 2009. This is an interesting story because this is also how I got to Kenya for the first time. It was in the Seychelles. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Patrick Pillay, invited me to come to his farm, the biggest cattle farm in the Seychelles, and needed my expertise for 7 days. That was humbling because I learned that when you go to these countries, you have to learn to listen before you speak. And I've tried to apply that as best as I can, and you do learn something. Even in the most God-forsaken, awful place in the world, they do teach you something. Sometimes it's what not to do, but they definitely do teach you something. The bottom right picture is just a generic picture of Boran. And what we ended up doing there, and I think now that COVID's over, we're going to do a few more of these exports, is we sent some Boran cows and bulls, or heifers and bulls from Kenya to the Seychelles. And that first shipment was incredibly well received. The cattle were well adapted. The locals loved them. And then they were ready to put second orders in, and COVID hit us. So I think we're going to carry on with that project. And that was my first experience seeing Boran in their natural environment and being raised the way that they're supposed to be raised. I think the South Africans have maybe tried to turn these Boran cattle into something that they're not by intensifying management and feeding and selection. And it was so refreshing coming to Kenya and seeing these Boran cattle adapted in their natural environment at altitude, on extensive conditions, just doing it well with perfect feet, good udders, good testicles, and cows raising fat, healthy calves. So I learned, my grandfather was a jack of all trades. And what I realized is the farms that he had developed were immaculate. I mean, it was exquisite what he had done, but he couldn't grow because he was too involved in the nuts and bolts of the situation. And the philosophy I developed was, so I'm going to use two different analogies, and hopefully you guys can catch on to one of them. And if you catch on to neither of them, then I apologize for being vague. The top right is just an illustration of a city, and the example I give is it's either a Phoenician or Egyptian or Roman city, where the emperor would be in the middle, and that city would have gates on every side, so a west gate and an east gate and a south gate and a north gate, and he would have gatekeepers that sit at those gates and watch what goes on from their gate out into the world. And once a week or once a month, all the gatekeepers come to the emperor and they explain to the emperor what the world looks like from their gate or from their perspective. Okay, and then he sees a 360-degree view of what the world really looks like. So he gets a real perspective on his world. And we just the same as emperors, as cattle farmers. We are kings in our castles. No one tells us what to do. We self-proclaimed philosophers and scientists. Plenty of ideas, more points than a blinking porcupine. And but we have this fence surrounding our property, and we have these gates leading into it. And the illustration I give is those gates all represent a discipline within livestock farming. So the 8 gates that I distinguish, or that I use in this illustration, would be genetics, herd management, nutrition, animal health, marketing, record keeping, forage management, pasture management, and then human capital or human resources. And the thought process behind it is that you need a gatekeeper or a specialist at every one of those gates. And if you ignore any one of those gates, your entire business can be lost just by having a gate without a gatekeeper at it. And when all those specialists report back to the emperor, being the farmer, he gets a 360-degree view of his business. If you try and be the specialist in all 8 of those gates, you exhaust yourself, or you can't grow because you run out of bandwidth or capacity. If you don't have a specialist at any of those gates, let's say, for example, you don't like numbers and you don't like record keeping and you've got no one doing it, that's where the wolves get in, and that's where the profit runs out. So the illustration there is basically having a gatekeeper or a specialist covering each one of those 8 divisions and reporting back to the emperor, where you really become a delegator and a designator more than someone who's lying under the Jeep all day. On the left, the idea there is exactly the same. A wheel with 8 spokes. They're all equally important, equal length. And that wheel, if they're different lengths or one's missing, it's not a very comfortable ride. So now we're going into the first quadrant or the first discipline, and that's the only one I'm actually can speak on with authority. Well, not authority, with some knowledge, and that's the genetics side and a little bit of the herd management side. And I think where the world has gone wrong in a lot of ways, in cattle breeding, and sheep and goats would be the same. A lot of these principles apply to all ruminants. So if you're in sheep and goats, it's similar principles. I've divided the different traits into what I call profit traits and then what I call turnover traits. And so much of the world is focused on muscle and milk and growth and marbling and stuff like that. But those, in my opinion, are not profit traits. Those are turnover traits. The four most important economic traits, firstly, are adaptability. If you're not adapted to your environment, it doesn't matter what your genetic potential is, it can't be expressed. So an adapted animal is essential. And second is functional efficiency. And what I mean by that is a balance between the physiology of an animal and the endocrinology of an animal, that all the bits and pieces are working correctly and in harmony. Thirdly, fertility. Obviously, if you've got a factory, which your mother cow or your ewe or your nanny goat is, if it's not productive, you don't have a business, right? And then longevity. You need these animals to last a long time because replacing them is expensive, and keeping passengers around to keep replacing animals, whether it's beef or dairy, sheep or goats, having animals that are around for a long time is definitely a profit trait. And then secondly, growth, muscle, milk, and marbling, which are often they're the shiny objects that people market. It's easy to point at them. They've got some sex appeal, where the profit traits are more, they're common sense, but it's hard to market balance, right? But balance is what keeps you in business. Muscle and marbling and growth will make headlines, but these profit traits are what keep you on the page and keep you in the story. Without those profit traits, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how much milk or marbling or growth or muscle you've got without the profit traits. So adaptability. On the left, we've got some Nelore cows in Brazil, which they're perfectly adapted to that environment, where for a lot of those cattle, they're ankle deep in water for 8 months of the year, very humid. They have massive challenges with insects and internal and external parasites. They have challenges with vermin and cats and stuff as well. So those cattle are perfectly in tune with their environment and perfectly adapted. Some of those cattle live on islands on the Amazon. They're dropped off as weaned calves, and they pick them up as 3-year-olds after that. So there's very little else that can adapt to that. And on the right, there's a Highland cow in the Scottish Highlands, perfectly adapted to her environment. That wind from the North Sea blows on her, that rains most afternoons. She's got a beautiful undercoat, and then that overcoat which protects her. So undercoat warms her, overcoat protects her, and she's sized right, and everything about this animal is blended in with her environment. And these are just examples of where we've also made a big mistake. The black and white Holstein Frieslands are a very good example of Friesians. Around the world, everyone's put these cattle in places where they're never going to adapt, and it drives a lot of the smaller producers out of business because they don't cover those profit traits very well. Functional efficiency, like I said, it's a balance between physiology and endocrinology. By efficiency, those feed efficiency bunks that I've illustrated on the left there, that's not what I'm talking about here. Look, that's a very good indicator of profitability in the feedlot, but as we'll touch on it later, it's not a great indicator at all of profitability on pasture. So that's feed efficiency. That's not what I'm talking about when it comes to functional efficiency. On the right, there's a Limousin cow with her calf. This does play into functional efficiency, where we need these cows to be weaning ideally 45 to 50% of their own body weight around 7 to 8 months, because a small factory with a big product is a profitable factory. And I think a lot of countries that have got their cows a bit big, they're never going to get that 45 to 50% efficiency, because there's no time to get that calf to that size. Anyway, with functional efficiency, it's all the glands working together. It's efficiency of movement. It's reproductive efficiency. So it's all the efficiencies that come into play with that. Fertility, I mean, just any business person knows that it's a huge profit driver, 10 times more important than growth in terms of economic driver, and just getting these cows to give us a calf on time every year is essential. And then longevity, like I said, replacing a cow. A lot of the modern dairies in West Texas, some of those cows are, well, on average, they're only producing 2 to 2.5 lactations in their lives. There's no profitability in that. If they could cut their milk in half and extend their lactations into 9 or 10 lactations, like some breeds can do, they'd be a lot more profitable. And the same with beef cattle. It's become a norm in a lot of countries for cows to be culled at 8 years old for subfertility or feet and leg issues, or cows just not being able to raise a calf anymore, and that's just not profitable. And that's the amazing thing about the Boran breed, is how long these cattle can last. And bulls that are out working as teenagers with sound feet and soft joints and plenty of athleticism, it's not a norm worldwide. It's a huge asset when it comes to profitability. Growth or weight, the other two extremes on the left, there's a Chianina bull in Italy. As you can see, that's a normal-sized man, and then on the right is a miniature Galloway, which goes extreme the other way. And I like right-sized cattle, and I've got a little formula that I'll share later with how to get to a right-sized cow. I think you can be way too small, and you can be way too big too. So maybe the ideal is somewhere slap bang in the middle of those two extremes. Muscle, similar story. On the left, you've got those 3 Belgian blue bulls. On the right is a Wagyu cow. But I think with muscle too, we probably ideally want to be somewhere between the Belgian blue and that Wagyu for most producers in most circumstances. There's always outliers and reasons for doing things, and you can justify it, but the 97% of cattle production needs to be slap bang in the middle of those. Because remember, all these traits are antagonistic to each other. So you put on too much muscle, you're going to lose fertility and milk. Okay, I might seem like I'm picking on these Belgian blues, but again, milk is similar. There's a Belgian blue cow that has no milk, and even when she is wet, she's not going to have very much milk at all, just because of how out of balance she is and how extremely muscled she is. And then the Holstein cow on the right, in a beef situation, obviously she's going to have way too much milk to be able to conceive every year, and to be able to be reproductively sound for a long time. So with milk, again, we probably need to land right in the middle of those two animals. Marbling is a big trend, and it's taking off all over the world now. On the left, there's some Wagyu well-marbled beef. On the right, there's some beef with absolutely no marbling in it. Very lean beef. And again, we probably need to be slap bang in the middle for most producers in most scenarios. I acknowledge I've got a Wagyu business. I understand how that 1% works. But if we made everyone produce Wagyu, it would become a commodity, and they're so slow growing and inefficient, it would drive us all out of business. So we have to have Wagyu done exclusively as a luxury product. And on the right, our sheep shearers in South Africa, from a flavor standpoint, fat is flavor. And so we need to be somewhere in the middle of those two. The question I get asked everywhere in the world is, what size should a cow be? And it varies. I mean, I'm judging the Angus National in Ireland in August. There'll be cows weighing 1,200 kilos. Genuine, not lying. 1,200 kilos. And then, like I said, those miniature Galloway cows are 200 kilos. So there's a very wide spread, and you get asked this question. And the best answer I've come up with so far, and this is where I like interaction, because your scenario will help fix those numbers, but I just believe there needs to be a number. So the first point is those cows, to get the right size cow, it needs to be the appropriate nutrition. So you don't spoil her, she mustn't have the keys to the pantry, and you don't starve her. There's a strange mindset with some farmers around the world where they're proud of the fact that their cows live on nothing. So appropriate nutrition and management. And the usual measure is your leading commercial producers in your area, whatever the norms are in terms of supplements and licks that they give them. The second thing is going to be different for Kenya. So instead of 27 months, they need to, I'd say, calve by 38 months. And this is a number that's fluid. Okay? I'm not holding anyone to this number, so don't misquote me and hold me to it too. But I think we need to have a number that is a minimum cutoff at what age that animal gets into production. Again, don't point the muskets at me, but conceive in a 90-day breeding season, and that can be a 60-day breeding season eventually. There are huge advantages to these breeding seasons in most cases for most producers. I know there are exceptions and outliers. But what it does is you can manage and select your herd with good contemporary groups, so you can compare apples and apples, and it's good in most cases for management too, to get your calving done and manage large groups in those contemporaries. And I know there are variables when it comes to this, for sure. Whatever your breeding season is, those cows, individual cows, need to calve annually and on time within that same time period every year. So if your cow calving every year isn't good enough, it needs to calve on time every year, because February one year and July the next year is not very efficient. And then establish a minimum weaning weight at 7 or 8 months. And the reason for doing this is it stops your cows from getting too small. So you'll have it, whether you're selling oxen or steers or weaners, you'll know in your environment, your management system, your genetics, there is a calf that at weaning, it doesn't cut it. And you know that isn't going to work for you. So throw any random number out there. Let's say it's 200 kgs or 220, or in some areas it's going to be 180, in some it's going to be 300. Depends on your operation, but it needs to be established. And what happens if that cow doesn't wean a calf at that weight, either it doesn't stay in the herd that you're going to select your seed stock out of, or it gets a free trip to town. The calf must be at least 45% of the cow's weight at that 7 or 8 months, and you can go too high with this too. I think that when you start pushing into the high 50s and 60s, you're probably getting cows that are overproductive in terms of milk and growth, and then they're going to lose out in terms of fertility and getting them rebred when it comes to the to the breeding season again. So I think there's a nice cushion between 40 and 50 and around 45 to 50 ideally at that age. What that does is it stops your cows from getting too big, because 1,000 kg cow is not going to give you a 450 kg weaner. Not. Maybe one might, but as a group they're not going to do it. So this forces your cows to be the right size. And you do this every year, and within 4 or 5 years, every cow that's in your system is the right size. And that right size is going to differ from property to property, and definitely from country to country and breed to breed. So evaluating livestock for structure and phenotype, this is a passion of mine. I really enjoy working with herds of cattle and evaluating them for this. And the 3 brief philosophies I like to work with here, and then there's a few points within them, is focusing on cattle, firstly, that can eat and walk and reproduce. Okay, just fundamental givens. So when you've got bad feet or bad jaws, or bad testicles or udders or vulvas or secondary sexual traits that aren't there, you don't even pass begin. Okay, so those are your givens. And then secondly, like I discussed earlier, is you focus on the four most important economic traits: adaptability, functional efficiency, your fertility and longevity. And then you look at muscle, milk, marbling, growth if you need to, and remembering that those second four are irrelevant if you don't have your first four in place. And so with these cattle, obviously basic things that we need are dimensions, so you need them to be long and deep and thick appropriately and in a balanced fashion with no extremes. What do I mean by balance? For me, balance is three things. The first thing is skeletal balance. So these cattle must, their skeletons must be proportioned correctly, and each body part must blend into the next body part appropriately and smoothly. Secondly, a balance between true muscle shape and fat. And we need both of those things because we're in the meat industry, but also fat is the energy that drives the factory. So we need these cattle to be in good body condition. But we don't just want fat cows with no muscle, and we don't want over-muscled cattle with no fat. So balance between that. And then hormonal balance. So females that look like ladies and bulls that look like they've got that testosterone pumping through their veins. So that's so basically it's physiology and endocrinology all balanced up. And then I do believe that quality cattle come in all different shapes and sizes and colors. But it's easy to make big ones and little ones. And the art of breeding is in making good cattle. And then once you've made that good one, then that good one needs to fit your objectives and your resources and, most importantly, your environment. So these are the steps that it takes to find that appropriate animal. So while we're on fat, is it good, bad, or ugly? A lot of industries around the world have penalized fat. From the consumption side, fat has been blamed for all of sugar's evils. Fat is essential as an energy source within an animal. It's brain food for humans, and it's food for productivity in animals. So your cattle with better body condition that are naturally fat, not fat from the feed bucket, fat from being genetically fat, the balance sheet in their favor is incredible. So those cattle are earlier maturing, so they reach fertility at a younger age. The cows get into estrus, heifers get into estrus, the bulls are fertile at a younger age. Those cattle are more fertile. The cattle forage better, your fatter cattle. The fatter cattle are much better in terms of temperament, and those cattle are way better eating experience for 99% of people, not Colin, he likes lean meat, but 99% of normal people like some fat in their meat because that's flavor, okay? The negative side of fat is the feedlots and packing houses, they love lean cattle because you can keep growing them at a good amount of kilograms per day for a long time without changing them into cattle. The fat cattle get finished too quickly for them if grain is cheap. And they have manipulated and enforced propaganda to try and make the cow-calf guys believe that lean cattle are better because they prefer feeding lean cattle. So lean cattle can be profitable in the feedlot, but they certainly aren't profitable in a cow-calf operation. So basically, it's about balance. It's about breeding cattle that are fundamentally good and cover all the bases and all important traits that aren't extreme in any direction. And 2 points I want to make there is I don't believe in antagonistic breeding or breeding corrective mating. I think that you breed like to like and you get what you like. Okay, so you breed cattle that are balanced and cover all those traits, and you keep using those bulls over and over and over again until your entire cow population is similar. So when you've got a cow that looks like a dairy cow, that's a big Holstein-looking cow, don't breed her to the thickest, dumpiest little bull that you can get, because what you get is some in the middle and you get some outliers on either side. So antagonistic breeding or corrective mating creates casualties in terms of cattle that don't fit into your program. When you keep breeding like to like, you can hold the middle very, very well, and just keep culling out animals that don't fit that ideal body type and maturity pattern that works in your environment. The second thing is, you'll see these are all show cattle. A lot of my time is spent judging shows all over the world. I'm not particularly fond of show cattle, but I like cattle shows, okay? Because it's an opportunity, if done correctly, to get philosophies out there into a captive audience that can hopefully move the needle in the right direction in increments. I reject the thought that cattle shows are fundamentally bad in principle, because it's not the cattle show that's making the bad cattle, it's the judges that they pick to judge those shows. If we had judges across the world, and there are some industries starting to do this better now, where they're picking these cattle on functional efficiency and adaptability and fertility and longevity, then those shows can go out and push a message into the industry that can be good. From a global perspective, we have a lot of opportunities, and you're very well poised in East Africa too. There's a lot of noises and rumblings in the Middle East about finding more opportunities to get livestock, cattle, sheep, and goats from Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. You guys have the volume in terms of numbers to supply those markets. You're logistically very close to them. I mean, beef consumption around the world is going up, even in countries like the US, where there's all kinds of noise on the coastlines about eating less beef. It's still going up because these middle classes are growing. There's upward mobility, and people, once they acquire that taste for protein, it's only when countries become overdeveloped that they start diversifying into other food products like soy or alternative proteins. China is a good example of this. I spoke at the World Braford Congress in Paraguay about 4 years ago, and at that point, the average Paraguayan was eating 69 kilos of beef a year. Okay, so at a dinner with women and children involved included, they would have 500 grams of beef per person. Okay, that's solid. But look, they take about 4 hours to eat it, and there's red wine, and there's much laughter and joy. But they're consuming it. At that time, China was eating 3 kilograms of beef per person per year. Okay, I can do that on a weekend. Okay. But they were going to double that to 6 kilos in the next 10 years. So we're halfway there now. When they get to 6 kilos, it'll take a beef industry the size of Brazil, which is 220 million cattle, just to supply that deficit between 3 and 6, which there's no such thing as that. You're not going to make another Brazil. So from a macro point of view, macroeconomics, the beef price is going to go up because of this growth of these middle classes in these developing countries. And that is very, very good news for our industry. Finally, we're going to start getting rewarded for our product. Even in the US, there are fewer cows. We've plateaued in how many cattle we can run. More practitioners, farms are getting cut up. I mean, the average herd size in the US is only 29 cows. Like, I know you'd see all the adverts and the movies with these thousands of cows, and it's very different to Kenya or Zimbabwe, even South Africa, where our herd sizes are pretty big. Over there, your average is very, very small. But there's opportunities there in being more efficient in what they can produce with those fewer cows. This graphic I like showing here is where we sit in terms of a very good balance between humanely producing our product and being sustainable. So in the middle, you'll see those Simmental fleck-free cows in the Swiss Alps. Beautiful scenery. Those cows are very sustainable because they've got them in a management system that works, and it's humane. It's difficult for all these humane societies to point fingers at that, because it's a postcard backdrop. You guys have got a very similar scenario over here. These cows are run extensively all year round, very humane, very sustainable as well. On the right, you've got your chickens or your pigs, incredibly sustainable. As long as there are humans on Earth, chickens are in good stead to exist as a species because they live side by side with us. And so sustainable, same with pigs in most countries. But the humane societies can point to them very easily and they can get themselves in trouble there. And on the left, wildlife, so whether it's deer or salmon or what you got here with your antelope species, very humane. I mean, you can't find something more humane than living off impala, but you're not going to feed 7.5 billion people with salmon and impala. It's not going to happen. We've got too many people now, so we're going to have to hit that sweet spot between being humane and sustainable, and we own that. Sheep, cattle, and goats own that space. Challenges. Okay, so I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here because there's a lot of context needed when discussing these challenges. On the left, those are miniature Galloway and Highland calves in Norway. Big demand for these miniature Highland and Galloway calves because they get subsidized per head per year, and they figured out if they can run double the amount of cows, they get double the subsidy. So now they're asking us for these miniature cattle. Subsidies can create a very, very artificial production environment and system, which is just not good for food production. And on the right is quotas, again, those Belgian blue bulls. In Belgium, they limit you to how many cows you can run. So let's say, for example, like say you're running 18 cows on your property. They're going to be the 18 most extreme animals that you can run. And these cows are routinely C-sectioned or cesarean sectioned. None of them, they don't even try to give birth naturally. On the third calving, that's the last calf that cow has. They get slaughtered after they raise that calf. Quotas can produce a artificial production environment as well. There is a caveat or exception to this, is that on some of the tropical, well, all the island countries, South Pacific, Caribbean, Indian Ocean countries, even up in countries like Iceland, where with food security being as big an issue as it is, and so a meme was sold by the major regional powers around the world that free markets are the way to go. Embrace capitalism. Let's open, drop tariffs and let's just exchange product. And what that did was the livestock producers on those islands, there's no way they could compete with the mass-produced beef, chicken, or pork or eggs that were coming in from the major countries. And they literally opened their gates and turned their animals loose because there was absolutely no need or way they could sustain keeping them. But then what happens is the coronavirus happens, and then there's the supply chain issues. Boats aren't going, flights aren't coming anymore. The odd hurricane goes through there, and what they're left with is no food on the shelves and no farmers producing any product. So that's why I said this is a little bit nuanced. Again, subsidies and quotas don't work in most situations for most people, but when you're isolated like a small island, whether it's the Caribbean or Indian Ocean, South Pacific, even countries like Iceland, you actually have to prop your farmers up and subsidize them and tariff incoming goods just for food security when all these challenges happen. And they happen in the islands more than they happen anywhere else. Communism is a challenge to production. That's in Cuba. That was my grand champion bull at the Brahman National in Cuba a few years ago. The next day, and you'll see, he's not the worst Brahman bull you've ever seen. He's not the best. He's okay. He's a good bull. They sold him for $450 the next day. And I didn't even know how to speak to the owner. And he said to me, look, it's all owned by the government. We're just transferring money from one division to another. Average wage is $25 a month. So the gist of it was that communism takes away the incentive to produce better animals because there's no reward for it. And what Cuba's become is a population of 3 million cattle that are just reproducing. They're not breeding them. They're just turning over genetics. Socialism. It's one of my favorite places in the world. That's the Pampas in Argentina. Magical cattle country. You almost can't touch it in terms of having an equal to it in producing cattle around the world. So Argentina flirted with socialism in around 2000 to 2010, and for some reason they're revisiting it now. What they did was they banned beef exports, 95% of beef exports, because the geniuses in government thought this would make beef cheap for their constituents. And what could go wrong? I mean, you have cheap beef for all the people who voted for you. It's a fairy tale. But like I said, farmers aren't stupid. So they're not going to use that pampas to make cheap beef for the people that voted against them. So they moved all the cows off the pampas and planted soybeans for China. And Argentina went from 60 million head to 50 million head in less than 6 years. They lost 10 million head of cattle. And what happened to the price of beef? Higher than it had ever been. And then that is one of the drivers that got them out of power. And for some reason, people have got very short memory spans. They're back in power again after 12 years now. But socialism also produces false markets. This is just north of here. It's a Dinka herdsman with his Dinka cattle. Wars and political unrest are also not ideal at all for producing sustainable livestock. This is actually a graphic I love showing in Texas. These Dinka herdsmen are very similar to the Texan ranchers. They love their cattle and they love their weapons. But I told them, I don't think anyone would like to see pictures of those Texan ranchers without their shirts on there. They're not quite the same body type as our Dinka herdsmen. But this is what wars and political unrest do. They make it very difficult to improve livestock and to farm it efficiently. So the next challenge we've got are EPDs and genomics, or they're called EBVs in some countries, or BLUP, Best Linear Unbiased Prediction. So the good news is you can vaccinate against this. This is a science that was developed with good intentions, with record keeping that would guide us and be used as a useful tool in making decisions. Unfortunately, there are a lot of premises that are just not right. The assumption when building these EPDs was that everyone, everywhere, is measuring everything honestly and in large numbers and accurately in the same environment. As we know, none of that is true. The other thing they assume is that my average cow and Giles's average cow are exactly the same. So your 100 is your average. If you ratio 100, that's your average animal. When that average animal and my average animal get plugged into the system assumes that they're of equal value for that specific trait. Now, you and I know that's not true, correct? Because if Colin and I go to Giles's and he's selling his whole herd and Colin buys the best 50% and I buy the bottom 50%, not worst, I know they're all good, okay? But the lower 50%, and we farm next to each other, same management practices, same environment, same supplements, and then we wean our calves. His calf that ratios 100 at weaning and mine are obviously not the same because he got the best 50% and I got the bottom, but they assume that those two hundreds are equal, okay? That is when you get so smart that you become stupid. I mean, there's absolutely no logic in that. Then they went a step further and developed genomics, which now they take DNA and then they refine that EPD or EBV based on the DNA. So they find a marker and they turn that marker into a number. It's like a magical bridge that gets crossed. Somehow they figured that out, and they say that's even more accurate now. Okay. So if you're wrong already, this makes you even more wrong. Okay. Anyway, this is a useful tool if used in context. If you know who's inserting the data, it's a junk in, junk out system. So if you know who's inserting it and the context around it, it is useful. But unfortunately, the marketers got hold of it and the breed societies got hold of it. And now, if it was a Rolls Royce, the one driver doesn't have a license and the other one's intoxicated. It's not a good story, okay? Why I put that graph up, that's Dorian Garrick from New Zealand. He and I were speaking in Kazakhstan at a beef conference. And the blue line that goes up like that is showing that between 1980 and this was 2017, the average Angus steer in a feedlot in America was making $144 more for that feedlot. Amazing. And that was based on focusing on growth and ribeye EPDs solely, okay? Incredible. These guys are, I mean, that's a lot more profit, okay? Good for them. That red line shows that the average Angus cow in the US between that same time period was costing $136 more per year to manage, okay? So I failed maths, okay? I did. And I got kicked out of accounting for being at the Bloemfontein show during exams, okay? But that means that as a cow-calf producer, you are giving up $136 so that someone else can make $144. Doesn't make sense. There's absolutely no sense in that. It's total foolishness. And I think that's where I think we need total context on how we use these numbers if we do use them at all. On the right is recreation, can also be a challenge. Fortunately, you don't have this industry, this show industry of showing every weekend. That's a show steer. Beautiful haircut, big fluffy haircut. What they do to get that haircut from a genetic standpoint, keeping them in coolers through the summer, injecting them with snake venom to get the blood thin so the hair will grow out a bit. There is no more artificial animal in the world, bar maybe a standard poodle or a miniature poodle, than that. But what happened? Look, it's an amazing sport. These kids, they play this. They show animals instead of playing rugby or cricket or tennis or whatever, and it teaches them how to win and how to lose and work ethics. So it's an amazing sport. But the problem is, the philosophy they've come up with is that it's not about the animals, it's about improving the children. My counter argument to that with all these steer shows I'm doing, and I said, you can raise a good child with a good animal. You don't have to have a bad animal to raise a good child. So we're working on this. It's going to be tough because when they leave this sport and they go back to the family farm, they don't totally forget what they learned in that sport, and you start seeing some of this infiltrate into the industry. This is a map of the deaths from GMO consumption over the last 30 years. That is not a black and white map. That's a color map. And as you can see, we haven't had one death yet from genetically modified organisms over the last 30 years. There's a lot of pushback from a lot of sectors from this, and I understand the resistance to it. I totally do, okay? But the realistic realistic predictions, if we gave people their wish and took GMOs off the table completely, we'd be looking at moving 1.2 billion people back into hunger and starvation. Just the yellow rice they developed, the GMO in China, it changed the lives for those Chinese people. The reason why we don't lose people from drought and famine anymore is because of GMOs and fossil fuels, right? So you have a massive drought in Ethiopia, and everyone's hungry, and these big USAID jets fly in with GMO corn. They drop it off there, and suddenly you can't make jokes about Ethiopians being thin anymore. Suddenly they start bulking up because of that. So I think it's very dangerous to demonize part of our food production family, which is those GMO crops, because they have a place in feeding. Like I said, we're not feeding 1 billion people anymore. It's 7.6 billion people. We need to come up with some different ideas. And there are checks and balances, obviously, but I would deem it maybe immoral to demonize GMOs. Another ally we have in food production that we need to link shields with is fossil fuels, and especially at the grass breeding cattle conventions I speak at. This way, I get a lot of pushback because, the sun is the primary source of energy, and there's really a need to move away from fossil fuels, etc. The truth of the matter is, and why the same people that are demonizing animal production are the same people that are demonizing. This is just another arrow in their quiver. It's the same people that are demonizing it. Without oil and natural gas and coal, we would be like we were 200 years ago, where everyone lived in poverty. There was royalty and there were aristocrats, and 99% of the people were poor. And we all farmed with 2 cows, and everyone was a farmer. Everyone. 99% of the world were farmers 200 years ago, with a few chickens and pigs and cows. The concept of a holiday or a vacation was completely foreign. Sport for recreation, unless you were a gladiator in Rome, completely foreign. The idea that you could see the rest of the world or learn about the rest of the world was completely foreign. And then 3 things happened. One is the Industrial Revolution changed our lives, where it made most of the world wealthy at this point. Second thing was the freeing up of markets, and that free market capitalism within defined markets changed. And then the third thing is liberation of women. So you take those 3 things, or any one of those 3 things away from a country, I promise you don't want to live in that country. So we produce food. This is the food of food. Those machines that harvest crops, the machines that get our product to market, the machines that got every single one of us here today. I was watching you guys flying in your planes and trucks. No one rode a bicycle here today. And it's because of fossil fuels. Feedlots get demonized a lot. And the people who are demonizing them live in Manhattan, New York. They demonize the feedlots in Manhattan, Kansas. And it's a very, very interesting logic that they use. So they don't like the feedlots in Manhattan, Kansas, because we're grouping all these cattle into small areas, and they're not grazing on green pastures with beautiful scenery for that time of their lives. They're not foraging. They're getting fed a total mixed ration. These cattle have people who ride through them every day to check what's healthy and what's sick, and doctor them. There's shade for when it's hot, and they've got walls built up for barriers for when it's cold or windy or snowy. And that's not natural. This is not how cattle need to be raised. Say the people in Manhattan, New York, who all live on top of each other, who are not foraging or hunting for nuts and fruit and hunting for deer or catching fish. They go to the total mixed ration shop, the pizza store at the corner of the street. They also have a doctor on every block. They have air conditioning to keep them cool, heat to keep them warm, and they live there by choice in that feedlot. And yet they don't want people to feed cattle and treat them in exactly the same way as they're treated. Mind-blowing. I don't know how they came up with that logic. We are going to touch on religion and politics a little bit. These are challenges and opportunities. That top left up there, that's not a prison. That's the boundary fence around a farmhouse in South Africa. And what happened there was when they took our weapons away, and law and order became corrupt. So there was law and disorder, and there was no protection for producers that were in remote areas. Remember, same as you guys, if you 10 or 20 k's from your closest neighbor, you're an easy target. So having to put up fortresses around your house is a challenge. There's some people who don't have an appetite for living like that, and that can affect food production for sure. Top right, I spent 10 days last month in India, where the Hindu Nationalist Party has outlawed beef slaughter in all their states except for 2. They've got the largest population of cattle in the world, 330 million cattle, okay, about a third of the world's cattle, but they can't eat them. And these bull calves, they've got a big dairy, they produce the most milk in the world, but the bull calves are just turned loose out on the streets, and they're eating the food that people should be eating, and the people are hungry, okay? So it's a challenge. Now, the opportunity it created, the cow is sacred in Hindu culture, okay? But it's not as sacred as the rupee. So what they've found is that by smuggling cattle across the Bangladesh border to be consumed by the Muslims, it's purged some of the bulls out, and it's become the largest export market in the world. And fortunately, their love for the rupee is greater than their love for the cow. Bottom left is a cattle ship moving out of Brazil. So the Middle East, at the end of Ramadan, when it's Eid, they need live cattle for sacrificial slaughter. And obviously, the Middle East just doesn't have the means to produce all these cattle, so they bring them in from Brazil. It would be far more efficient to have fresh or chilled or frozen beef sent there, but because of their needs, it creates an opportunity. So there's ships coming out of Brazil that load 25,000 cattle at a time. There's 100,000 head sheep ships coming out of Australia to the Middle East, and this has created a market for supplying that need. Okay, so these lab-grown beef is a challenge that we're going to face, where they take stem cells and or cell lines and grow those cell lines in laboratories and then feed us with that. It is a genuine protein. I mean, the DNA is the same as the beef that we produce. I just know from having met and seen enough people in enough countries that there'll be a cultural resistance to that. People aren't going to be comfortable with consuming lab-grown beef, especially not the people that have an issue with genetically modified corn or rice. They're not going to eat lab-grown beef, and if they do, I mean, then I can't help that hypocrisy at all. The other problem is it's too expensive. They're going to have to work very hard to get the price of that stuff down. I don't know anyone who can afford it yet. And they probably will get it down, but they're going to have cultural challenges with that. Middle classes don't develop and aspire to luxury products, which were luxury when they were aspiring to it, to end up eating something that's grown in a petri dish. And then on the right, this is the Impossible Burger, Impossible meat that's made up of, it's vegetable-based and chemical-based and all other kinds of toxins and whatever else they put in. There's like 20 different ingredients in these burgers. And they've had to inserted so much sodium into it to give it any flavor at all, because animal fat brings flavor, so they've had to make an artificial thing there. So it's not very healthy. The other thing we need to know for sure, and I think this is where, from an educational standpoint, that a purely vegan or vegetarian diet kills a lot more animals than a meat-eating diet does. Because when you do monocrop agriculture and you have these massive soy fields or whatever cereal crop they're growing, you're killing every bug, every mole, every prairie dog. You're killing every bird. Obviously, all your deer or your antelope has to leave there. So you've got to decide, well, they've got to decide how cute an animal needs to be for them not to kill it. Because for some reason, they have a massive issue with sheep and goats and cattle being eaten, but no issue at all with the devastation that they cause with changing those environments. This is, and I think this goes on to all these topics, just context and nuance. And so I played rugby and cricket, or let me put it this way, I played sport at Rhodes, and but if I didn't tell you what sport I played, you could assume I was a bare knuckle boxer or I did lawn bowls, okay? Because they're both a sport. So we've got to get into contextualizing all these subjects. And one thing we get blamed for a lot, and now suddenly they've found a scapegoat for the changes in the environment and climate, is they're blaming it on cattle and cattle belching out methane into the environment, into the atmosphere. This is where we need to get smart with contextualizing and nuance. So when you get called a climate killer or climate denier or whatever other word they use with us, just ask them what they mean by that and how are we affecting the climate. And the 97% of scientists that agree that man is responsible for climate change, to what degree are we responsible, and is the climate getting warmer a good thing or a bad thing? Or have the conversation, because at the moment there is no conversation to be had. You struck down merely for the fact that you raise cows, and we've got some very good literature now that shows that livestock production done the right way is incredibly useful to fixing the environment and the climate. But I think on every subject we've discussed so far, it's not black and white. There's nuance and context needed for all of this. This is a percentage of global pasture area. Depending on how you classify it, 40 to 60% of the world is covered in global pasture. And there's really three things we can do with it. The first thing is we can just leave it, let it rot, and the poisonous gases that will be emitted from that will be extremely harmful. Second thing is we can just burn it, which that carbon dioxide is going to be a pollutant that also isn't ideal. Or we can graze it, and we graze it with ruminants and take that low protein product, put it through a rumen machine, produce that high protein eating experience that's nutritious, that is plentiful, that's reliable, that is that's healthy, and also that is affordable. We've got an affordable product out there. I think the third option is, without a doubt, the best option of what to do with all this pasture land. And there isn't another thing we can do. Or am I missing? Is there something else we can do? Golf courses, but that's more boring than sex. So, or you can just keep cutting it and leaving it. But I think that we have the solution to what do we do. We just need to message this better of what to do with that pasture. Just some interesting statistics. So the top 5 countries by cattle inventory in the world is India with 330 million cattle, Brazil with 220 million, China with 130, US with 94 million, and then Argentina with 50. Now Ethiopia is moving up, and they're going to be very close to where Argentina is. The interesting statistic here is that 75% of the world's cattle are only in these 5 countries. It's not I don't know if it's good or bad. It's just a statistic. It's interesting. Of the 207 countries in the world, 75% are in 5 of those countries. The number 1 beef producer in the world is the US, even though it's only number 4 in terms of inventory, and that's just efficiencies of production and efficiencies of getting that beef product out. Number 1 dairy industry in the world is India, and that's just sheer numbers. Low output per cow, but just a lot of dairy cows. But one thing that is good for us is that every country in the world either has cattle, eats beef, or drinks milk, and most of them do all 3 of those things. So this is a global industry that we're in, and we have a very good footing globally throughout the world. I believe in using a toolbox when you're selecting animals. So is it phenotype versus genotype? Is it phenotype and pedigree and expected breeding values, or EPDs, or genomics, or is it in-herd numbers or indexes that are developed? I think in the right context and in the right balance, you can use all of those, but I think that just make sure you're using a hammer to drive a nail and not a hammer to try and screw a screw in. That the biggest thing is we need to use the appropriate tools for what our actual objectives are. So these cattle, like I said, need to eat, walk, and reproduce. But on the right, there's a Limousin bull in the UK that's very straight in his hind legs, small testicles. He's not going to have the objective of being able to eat, walk, and reproduce. And you see he's very lean. He's not easy fleshed, not very good body condition, so that's going to affect his fertility too. And on the left, a red Angus bull that's got all of those attributes: really good testicle size and shape, good feet and legs, really good body condition. So these cattle need to be able to eat and walk and reproduce. Secondly, longevity. Udder quality comes into play a lot when it comes to longevity, and the Boran is blessed with naturally good udders. Like the cow on the left, that Simmental Fleckvieh cow, very level udder floors, appropriately sized and spaced teats, that fore udder that blends so nicely up into the body wall, well suspended udders, so they're always suspended above the hocks, and good definition of quarter, so you can see each quarter on those udders. And this is the longevity that keeps these cows going on, because one of the main factors around the world for cows being culled early is udder quality. You know, the udder floors collapse, or they dry up in one quarter, or the teats are inappropriately sized or spaced. Like that cow on the right, who's got a collapsed udder floor, fore udder doesn't blend at all into the body wall, so she's got no longevity left in her. What's in her head? This is where I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are as good as anyone in the world at selecting animals for appropriate skull shape, bulls with really strong heads, and females with appropriately heads that are appropriate in length, and good muzzles and good eye set. It makes a huge difference, and what's in a head follows through the body. So I've never seen a good bull with a bad head. It just can't happen. Like that bull on the right, a North American Angus bull, long narrow head, small eye right in the top of his head with hardly any eye bank, underdeveloped jaw, narrow muzzle. He is going to be harder doing, he is going to be wild, he is going to be later maturing. That small little eye right at the top of an animal skull, whether it's a horse or a cow, those are your crazy ones. And then on the left, that bull is very appropriate, and it's the way you guys select your bull skulls too. Medium to short head, a lot of width between the eyes, good eye bank, a kind, soft eye, placed well inside the skull, broad muzzle. Remember, the width of an animal's muzzle is exactly the same as the width between its pin bones. So you can't have a thick animal with a small muzzle, and a well-developed jaw, because these are foragers. Another thing that the US has gone away from, this throat latch. You take a throat latch out of a bovine, and you lose that fleshing ability and softness and adaptability out of them, because you're tightening that skin so much that you've got no room for growth. Feet and legs, it's essential that we work on these feet, and in the most part, you guys have done a tremendous job in selecting cattle, or nature selected cattle, to have good feet and legs, good heel depth, evenly sized toes, not too much space between the toes not too close together, and a good square foot under the appropriate amount of bone. Remember, we're not in the ivory business, so we don't want these bulky legged animals, and we don't want animals walking on pins either. We need a good foundation that's appropriate to the amount of body it's got to carry it around. Like that Brangus on the left, very good testicle size, shape, and suspension, and a beautifully shaped sheath. All the sexual organs above the hocks in that situation. And what we like seeing with adapted cattle is those testicles to be well suspended. As soon as you get British cattle or unadapted cattle into the tropics and subtropics, one of the first things that happens is the scrotum drops, and that length, the neck of the scrotum has to get longer so it can regulate temperature in those testicles, and you start seeing tropical degeneration. But that's just an example of a Hereford bull in Alabama, and because of the heat and humidity, his testicles dropped, and that becomes also a longevity issue. You know, injury can take place with animals like that too. Feminine wedge shape and analyzing body dimension, the Wagyu on the left, as you can see, deep-chested and tight-flanked, so hormonal balance is out. Like I said to the guys earlier this morning, we want our females to have a face like a princess and a bum like a cook. That's what the cows must look like. That's what the Angus cow on the right looks like up in North Dakota. Beautiful, sweet-headed, smooth-shouldered, and then she gets progressively deeper and thicker as you move back into her flank and hind quarter. Maternal and terminal body types. There's a place for both these types if used correctly. Again, here's using a tool correctly. On the left, there's a Hereford bull in Wyoming. Very maternal, a flatter muscle, easier fleshing, deep-bodied, that makes good maternal cows. On the right is a blonde Aquitaine bull. Not as much depth of body, more definition of muscle, a drier animal with not as much fleshing on it. Animals like this work well if you are going into the feedlot industry. You cross these cattle over your maternal cattle and terminate all the calves through the feedlot, male and female, and then they have a place because they've got that extra growth and muscle. Temperament is an economic trait, so we can't tolerate crazy cows. Like with labor issues, health and safety, those crazy cows. The University of Washington State has developed a science showing that your crazy cows are also subfertile. We need to get back to breeding cattle that are easy to handle, easy to work with. It's another attribute within the Bos Indicus influenced cattle family. Boran has done a tremendous job in getting its temperament in check. Hide color and its effects on infrared and ultraviolet rays. This is very important. So, unfortunately, in a lot of countries, certified Angus beef has convinced everyone they need black-hided cows, even in areas with very strong infrared rays, so at low altitude on savanna-type pastures. And this is taking a lot of performance and production out of these cows because they get heat stress. Black can actually be very advantageous because black makes use of the ultraviolet better than any other color does. So especially when you get higher than here, like eldoret, black can actually be very, very valuable. What you don't want at altitude is no pigment. You don't want no pigment at low altitude anyway. There isn't an environment that you can justify having cattle without pigmented eyes or like their sexual organs not being pigmented, because there are two things that happens. The one is the ultraviolet and infrared is so stressful on those body parts that it can lead to cancer, but it also causes stress and they lose a lot of performance. And the second thing is when these animals eat poisonous plants and they get photosensitivity, the cattle without pigment, it's a huge hazard. They can die quite easily if you don't get them into shade quick enough. So pigmented cattle are certainly more favored than non-pigmented cattle. Hair coats in summer and winter. Just basically, we want cattle that can slick off as the daylight hours get longer. Light is the biggest driver to cattle slicking off in summer, and what happens is that light hits the body. Pituitary gland signals a signal to the brain. The brain hits the gonads. The gonads start producing estrogen. Estrogen starts shedding the hair off. So your most fertile cattle are going to be the ones that slick off earliest as the days start getting longer. So the sleeky, slick heifers, they're going to be your most productive females. Now in winter, there are areas, we felt today, it was cold this morning, and the areas all over the world that need cattle that can hair up very well in winter, and that is important. Hair grows in the dark. That's why cattle, that's the main driver to where cattle get their hair growth. You think about it, you shave in the morning because you've been sleeping in the dark all night. Again, just an analogy, Simmental fleck-free bull with very bad pigment, he would struggle at this altitude with that ultraviolet. You think about working outside in the sun all day here without sunglasses on, it's not fun. And then on the left there's a well-pigmented Hereford bull with good red eyes, good testicles, and you want pigment on the udders as well for sunburn and for snowburn. So it all correlates. All of this works together. And again, we want a balanced animal. Not extreme in any direction, but an animal that can eat, walk, and reproduce, that is balanced in terms of all its traits, that has muscle but also fat, that has hormonal balance, and these are the cattle that at the end of the day are profitable regardless of what breed or what environment you're in. And that's just an analogy again of a balanced Limousin terminal bull in Sweden, balanced Beefmaster bull in Mexico, very balanced Angus cow in Canada. Well, let's see. So that's what I've got for this segment. Thanks again for inviting me to be here. I'm thrilled. I'm really enjoying my time.
So when you've got cattle that haven't got that capacity behind the shoulder, you lose a lot of function. What I also love about her is that fleshing ability. She's an incredibly good body condition, but as you can see on her brisket, she's still full of function and freshness. She hasn't got any excess fat on her brisket. She's still got that pleat of skin fold from her brisket up through her dewlap and into her throat latch. So the epitome of a functionally efficient female. This female, you're not going to see her move now, but when you do see her move, she's just so effortless and flawless in her athleticism. She's got a beautiful foot on her, soft, clean joints, good angles on her shoulder and on her hind leg. So when she moves, she does so effortlessly. Very nice udder development to appropriately sized teats and spaced teats. And then when you get behind her, you see a well-developed vulva, so her sexual organs are really well-developed. And she's a well-muscled female, but she's not coarse in her muscle. She's nice and flat-muscled and smooth-muscled, so she's very maternal in her muscle type, and she's got that extra fleshing and body condition that we're looking for too. I like this more refined female attribute that she has and how feminine and maternal she is through her skull. And I think then when you look at the bull, he's got the same qualities but in that masculine form. Very masculine in his head, a good jaw on him, very broad muzzle, nice short to medium length head with a lot of width between the eyes, a well set eye inside those eye banks. But you can see he's masculine. He looks at you as though you've just ridden over his puppy. You know, he's got some aggression in him in terms of having testosterone, but he's still beautifully natured. That neck and hump show that testosterone, and you look at the color of this animal too, and it shows the hormonal balance. A bull that's got good hormonal balance is always darker in his head and neck and hump, and he gets progressively lighter as you move back and down in his body. Tremendous testicle size and shape on this bull too. So you want those testicles evenly shaped, well suspended, and with a prominent epididymis like he has too. And then on feet and legs too, he has a bull that's just an athlete when he gets out and moves. And you can see he's not overly heavy boned, but he's got enough bone and enough foot, which is appropriate with his body condition. So with these Indicus cattle, Indicus influenced cattle, they've got this extra skin. And the reason why the skin is so important is because a Boran will have about 12 to 15% more skin than your European or British cattle, and that allows them to sweat more. So in these hotter climates, they have more hide, so they can sweat more. And also the Indicus cattle have almost double the amount of sweat glands per square inch. So they're not only sweating more per square inch, they've also got more hide to sweat more. So if we tighten these cattle up too much, they lose their ability to sweat, but then also their ability to grow and perform. Then the next two heifers, if we move on here, these are two heifers that we selected because I think in terms of body type, body condition, maturity pattern, they are almost ideal. I like I said in the presentation, earlier maturing cattle because those cattle get into production earlier. They're easier fleshing cattle, they're easier to handle, and they're just more functionally efficient. And both these animals, you can see incredible body condition on them, easy fleshing, but there's no coarseness through their brisket. There's no extra fat on either side of the anal fold, so that body condition and fleshing is very evenly distributed and uniformly distributed. And you can see you can get strength in these cattle, but maintain that maternal and femininity. Like the darker roan heifer, big jaw on her, strong muzzle, but she's still very maternal and feminine. There's no doubt about what sex she is. And in terms of frame size, you're probably going to find these two females land up being very appropriate mature frame size cows for this environment. And as you can see, beautifully pigmented. You know, black eyeliner, pigmented hooves, pigmented vulvas, and that's essential for this ultraviolet. Should we move on to the bull and the female? What we like here this bull has got so much strength and masculinity and breed character up through his head and neck and through his hump. And it correlates, like that correlates with the size of his testicles and the shape of his testicles, correlates with that muscle expression that he's got. That bull has got testosterone pumping through him, and it's evident in the way he's colored. You know, he's darker through his head and neck, lighter as you get towards his hindquarter, and everything about that bull just exemplifies masculinity. The cow, she's an interesting female. I actually remember her from when I judged in Nairobi in 2018, and she was just a heifer. A little bit of an outlier in the breed. She's maybe on the edge when it comes to how much foot and how much bone and how much body she's got. But she's unique in that she combines that with that maternal and femininity. She's still very maternal in her skull. She's still flat in her muscle shape. This is a Red Bull that I personally really liked yesterday. I think he's incredibly well balanced. From his nose to his tail, he blends and transitions from body part to body part. Ideally, he's got beautiful muscle, but he's also very well fleshed, outstanding on his feet and legs, gets out and moves well. And what we want in these bulls is we want some pride and presence. So it's important for a bull to be able to lift his head up, and that neck needs to come out of the top of his shoulders at the right angle, so that he can have presence and pride, and that shows skeletal integrity, which is linked up to longevity. So the bulls that walk with their heads down and can't pick their heads up, we want to move away from that. The grey bull is very similar in that way. Tremendous balance and presence. And as you can see, both these bulls are not going to be the thickest or the biggest or the longest or the heaviest muscled or the biggest boned. They're what we call complete and well balanced. Just completely covering every base in terms of the traits that we find important for profitability. That 7-step process we discussed earlier, what I would predict is within this group of females is when they walk through those 7 steps, the ones that are left after 4 or 5 years, which will be the vast majority of these, are going to be the ones that are playing in the middle of the field and are not on the extremes. So you're not going to have so anything that's slightly taller and slightly flatter might not still be here. Anything that is maybe shorter bodied and not without the volume and length of your median probably won't be here. And so what I'm getting at is the easiest way, if I was told to come and select, let's say 60% of these heifers, the easiest way to do it and still be reasonably right would be to peel off the ones that don't look like the average ones. So the ones that are bigger or longer or wilder, the ones that have got more bone or less bone or more muscle or less body condition. So you end up with something right in the middle, and you avoid your extremes and your outliers and your fringes, and that's going to give you the most productive herd to kick off with. And that's where cattle evaluation becomes very, very useful, because at every point of a livestock producer's year, you are evaluating your cattle. You're selecting a bull out of a contemporary to use. You're selecting females to use as replacement females out of a contemporary group. So evaluating cattle for functional efficiency and quality is a tool that's not only to be used by cattle evaluators and inspectors and judges. Every cattleman needs to make use of. One thing you'll also notice, and you're not going to see too many examples in this group, but when you see a heifer that's a little bolder shouldered and a little thicker necked, she's always going to have a smaller, tighter vulva as well. So the secondary sexual traits always correlate with your primary sexual traits as well. Another interesting aspect when evaluating females, the widest part of a female needs to be in that center rib region. As soon as a female's widest part becomes her hip bones, then you know that she's lost her hormonal balance and she's not functionally efficient anymore. So when you analyze your cows, you look at them from the front and or from behind. That mid-rib section needs to be the widest part of the cow. On the bull, it's lower down in the barrel. That's where the widest part of the bull is. So I know in South Africa we went through a time where a lot of the evaluators were trying to tell us that the widest part of a bull needs to be the hindquarters. So what that did was create these expressively muscled bulls with lacking some rib shape and center body dimension. And those bulls naturally lost testicle size, their skins tightened up, and they became less functional than the bulls that were at the widest in the lower part of their barrel. So the question is some comments on the height of the cattle and the length of their legs. So basically the longer legged cattle with a longer cannon bone or longer long bones are later maturing, which will also mean that they'll come into estrus later. They'll be harder doing in forage conditions. They're going to struggle to maintain the same body condition as the cows. So the idea is to have a moderately long cannon bone, or your long bones to be moderately long instead of too long, because you're going to have a lot more functional efficiency in your slightly shorter cannon bones. And the science behind that is that the sex hormones kick in when the growth hormones stop and when the bones ossify. So when the long bones take longer to ossify, the sex hormones take longer to kick in, and then you've got a less fertile and later sexually maturing animal, which is certainly not ideal in most management systems. The other thing, an example you'll see with the length of long bones or length of cannon bone is, and it's an example that you see very well with how the growth hormones stop and then the sex hormones start. With a steer, when you castrate him, his sex hormones are never going to kick in. And as you know, an ox never stops growing. He just keeps growing for the rest of his life. So what shut down growth is sex hormones. So the quicker you get those cattle sexually active and the females in estrus and the bulls fertile, that shuts down the growth hormones and you get an appropriately sized animal for that environment. Wanting to add more muscle to a steer, you'll cut him later because you want some testosterone in him so that when he gets onto feed, he's going to have that muscle expression. But if you want growth, if you want him to keep growing, and if you're going to kill him as a steer off grass at a slightly later age, it's probably better to cut him younger because you're going to get more growth out of him.
I'd like to thank Mark, Nicky and his team and the guys for hosting us, and part of your 8 spokes. Kelvin, I think you're the man who looks at everything out the gate. He just sits in the house and does bugger all. So on behalf of the Zimbabwe Boran Breeders Society, we'd like to give you a cap. Thank you very much, Kelvin. Thank you. And just one last thing, I'd like to thank Jimmy for sending Mandy down to us to teach us about the Kenyan Borans. And I'd also like to thank Jackie to make sure that he had booked a return ticket when he paid for his air flight. So, Jackie, thanks for getting the return ticket, and thank you all again.
I'd just like to thank Warrigus for hosting this day for the Boran Cattle Breeders Society. As usual, Mark's put on a good show. Thank you also to the Warrigus team for all their hard work in getting the place ready. Impressive as usual. Thank you to PJ for agreeing to come here. But thank you to Warrigus for paying for PJ or flying him here. Thank you very much all for coming.